We've kept you a little longer than we normally do, but I'd like to open it to questions. You've got a good group here that tends to.
Come on back.
Come on, Rebecca.
She got to do 35,000 foot. I got into the soil.
Down in the dirt.
Down into the dirt and the manure.
Come January, Susan Steinmark from Albemarle's Economic Development is planning, in the process of planning a agricultural forum for all the farmers in the area. And I think what your presentation, I would love to have you be part of that if possible. I think that what you're saying in combination with the concerns about the water issue is very, very important as part of the dialogue of what's taking place with the local farmers.
So I'm happy to help if I can. So Robbie knows how to reach me, and so just touch base with Robbie. I'll say that I'm very sensitive. You know, it's like I don't know if in the farming community when someone says I'm from Washington and I'm here to help you, right? So the state and municipal wastewater people, they have the same experience when Washington comes calling. It's like you kind of wonder, all right, what's going to happen now, right? Yeah. So I'm happy to come, but I would have to just make sure that I'm really working in concert with the agricultural groups here in the area, so that because they don't need me coming down to tell them how to do their business, right? And so if I can help, I'd be happy to.
Other questions, comments? Angus,
Um,
a farmer.
I'm not a big farmer at all. I'm a guy with a couple cows in the backyard, but.
My daughter wants me to move here to raise those cows, so.
All right. And I could raise them better if I could get chicken manure across the mountain from Harrisonburg, where they have way too much of it. And how do you see any opportunities for spreading things out a little better? We've got places in Shenandoah where the broiler operations are a major problem, there and throughout the Potomac headwaters. And I'm assuming that the land over there, it's a problem because the land they have to apply it on is oversaturated, and then there are places on this side of the mountain that are not so much, and there were some pilot projects to spread it out.
Broker that manure. Broker
but I think
manure.
they went away when the price of diesel doubled. Are there any innovative technologies in the ways to concentrate it, get it over, and know that could potentially raise some issues for the Ravenna if there's too much in the wrong places.
So the CAFA rule was adopted knowing that there were going to be places where there was more manure than was agronomically sound from either nitrogen, but more, that's mostly a phosphorus issue, I'm sure, in the Shenandoah. They have to deal with it. And my guess is at some point, we now, believe it or not, in the Delmarva broiler producing area, contrary to expectations or assumptions under the Bay model, only about 10% of that manure is actually used in the Delmarva today. 90% of it is shipped out of the watershed. And I imagine at some point that could be coming to the Shenandoah Valley as well. And I know, cattle production in the Illinois River portion of Arkansas is just boomed because that chicken litter has made their pastures just really productive. Really, really productive. So I know why you want that litter. It really will help that grass grow. And so I think it's going to come. They just have to implement the CAFO rule. And it'll take some time. It'll take some time. Everyone will have to come to terms with what that.
Well, what people are using instead are biosolids from Baltimore, Philadelphia, D.C., and which they get more or less for free. You see. I don't know if you want to touch on that issue at all.
I'm a big supporter in recycling our waste and using it rather than landfilling it or burning it. So, but I don't know how it plays out here in particular. But I'm a supporter of that, as long as we deal with the metals issues and things like that.
Other questions? Yes, Anne.
It's not really I guess it's not really a question, but I'd like to hear the people's thoughts. You've raised a few things, Tom, that seem to be themes that are growing across the country. One is the idea of simplifying regulations because they've gotten so complicated. Back to the basic trifold kind of approach to regulations. The cost efficiency, trying to be practical about cost versus benefits. The other theme that seems to be playing out is state versus local versus federal control. Who has the authority for what? Should it be the federal government does this and locals do that? Things have gotten so complicated, and I guess, are you hearing the same things? We have heard, I think there's a report to Congress called Breaking the Log Jam. It kind of talks about the Clean Air Act and how complicated and things like that. Are you hearing those sorts of things for clean water as well? How do we get to the things that you're talking about from a bigger picture?
Why don't we let Rebecca take it?
Please, yes.
I guess my last years of experience have basically been with the Chesapeake Bay program. And I haven't been, so it's been probably 8 or 10 years since I've paid a lot of attention to other areas. In the Chesapeake Bay program, I would say despite a lot of talking about it for 30 years, that until the DMDL requirement came, we weren't engaging the local governments at all, and despite various efforts to try to do so. And so the idea, and nor were the states engaging effectively with local governments. I had one state in the basin say, you feds stay away from our local governments, don't talk to them, it's our job, but then they weren't doing it. So I think we've only just begun to start to try to develop an integrated conversation around the watershed implementation plans, and I guess my hope was that instead of being so acrimonious about it, that those would turn into productive conversations. But I've not really heard, maybe other than the larger political debate that's now going on about regulations in general, I really haven't heard anything specific to our region about, for example, changing the Clean Water Act.
Many conversations have taken place about this issue. Roles and responsibilities, task forces at the headquarters level, at the regional EPA level, who does what has been, I think, from the day the Clean Water Act was passed. There were a lot of state officials that were not the least bit happy to see these young upstarts coming in and telling them how to run their organizations that many of them had been running for decades. So that roles and responsibilities, who does what, how do you pay for it, is just a continuing dialogue that we need to be having because it changes as new regulations come on board. And I think Rebecca's absolutely right. The states in the early days didn't want to work either with EPA or with local governments. They had their own programs, and that's the way they wanted to function. And I say that as somebody who represented them for a very long time. But that was one of those changes that Tom talks about, that it took a while. These are my jelly beans right here, and I'm not willing to share them. And now we're moving beyond that, but it's got to be a continuous dialogue because it's not a set relationship that stays. It's shifting and changing with everything that we do.
The only thing I would add is that the Clean Water Act is set up, and Rick heard this, I'm sure, back up in Pennsylvania in the courthouse last week. It's about cooperative federalism, and where much of the roles are given to the states, who in turn have to figure out how they're going to work with their localities. I think we're going to head more in that direction, not less, given where the federal budget has to go. We'll inevitably go. All of the discretionary federal agencies are in for a very rough time. We've already been cut a bunch, right? EPA and the NRCS and USDA. More is gonna come no matter what we do about this fiscal cliff. They're not gonna deal with Medicare and Social Security without taking more cuts out of federal discretionary agencies like EPA. So we're all gonna have to get more efficient, and the creativity is gonna be at the state level. And the thing that will challenge that, of course, is, you know, the legal recourses under the Clean Water Act to try and force things, and some of that will be productive, successful, others won't. You can't get blood out of a stone, right? So I think it's gonna get more efficient and more streamlined because it's the only thing we're gonna be able to look forward, and we're gonna still wanna make progress.
Well, I like your comment, and I think that's what we've been trying to do at DEQ. Everybody needs to take off the black hat and look at each other as you know, problem solvers and looking at the same goal versus coming to the table. You know, you've got the white hat, you're the black hat kind of thing. And luckily, we have people like Angela who help us facilitate those sorts of discussions when we develop new regulations.
Well, it is one of DEQ's goals to have an informed and engaged community. You know, stakeholders involved in this regulatory process. And trust me, I'm probably the only one in the entire United States who's been hired by a regulatory agency to increase and encourage community involvement. That's my title, Community Involvement Specialist. So we've facilitated all kinds of meetings where disparate groups get together and they have so many different perspectives. But by hammering it out and being part of the process, we end up with better regulations. We end up with people who've been involved in the regulatory process who then are more willing to follow the regulations, so we have lower, problems.
I'll give you an example. So there's some 40,000 TMDLs out there today.
Yeah.
Many of them have been done, right? They're all done. I go all over the country and I say to a farmer, you know, there's a TMDL in the watershed that you live in. There is? What's that? And they're identified in the implementation plan as the primary problem, and they don't even know it took place. They weren't even there for the conversation. And that's not. I'm not saying. I'm not. That's. And it's. That's. I'm not saying whose fault that is. It's not a question of fault. It's just we have to do better. We all have to do better.
Rick, you had a big smile on your face.
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of fault here, because for 39 of those 40,000, there are no implementation plans. Probably for 39.9, there are no implementation plans because there are no federal requirements for implementation plans. Virginia is one of the only states in the country that has a state requirement for implementation plans, and they're, what, 10 years behind the schedule? So they're just not. I mean, the TMDL program was gutted by, Republicans in Congress, 12 years ago. And it hasn't produced much of anything other than a ton of paper studies that go on the shelf. The reason those farmers haven't heard of the TMDLs is because they haven't meant anything other than, an academic study. That's one reason the Bay TMDL is very much, a matter of controversy at the other end of the spectrum, because EPA is trying its darndest to make it meaningful, to make it work. And you've seen the result.
So I disagree with your statement that they haven't been involved because it's been a paper exercise. That didn't mean anything. They haven't been involved because people weren't able to take the time to go out.
There's that too.
Because they didn't have the money to pay for the staff to do all that work and to have the patience to speak with everybody. And it's a problem.
Rebecca?
I was very sad when, just to tell you a little bit of a story about the Chesapeake Bay situation. We had water quality standards on the books, and the only way you can set these maximum daily loads is if you've got good standards. And so there were standards on the books that could not be implemented. They were written on the basis of literature surveys of what dissolved oxygen was necessary. So we had to go, before we did the total maximum daily loads for the Chesapeake, and one of the reasons for the delay is that we actually had to go back to the very beginning of the process and set new water quality criteria. Based on my experience with water quality standards, this is the only place in the nation where there was a participatory process for developing water quality criteria. Most criteria, that's the science behind standards, are set on the basis of laboratory studies done in EPA laboratories or in universities. But we developed a special process to try to get buy-in from the very beginning, from the bottom up, for the Chesapeake Bay wasteload allocations by saying, let's work together on the criteria. We had the states there, and thanks to the Hampton Roads Sanitation Authority, Hampton Roads paid for some very expert consulting scientists who went with us every day through that process. And in fact, the guys that were hired by Hampton Roads Sanitation District had an appreciable impact on our decisions, that is the federal decisions, about what to do, about whether to have chlorophyll numerical standards or not. Now, it was certainly self-evident that there weren't any farmers in the watershed, individual farmers, who were going to be able to afford to do what Hampton Roads Sanitation District did and send in scientists to sit down with us. I would have hoped, however, that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or at least one of the state departments of agriculture, would actually perform that role, but they didn't. And so the best you could say was that using the state partners that chose to participate, who were from the DEQs of the world, like Virginia DEQ, or the federal scientists, or the university people, we did the best we could to set those water quality standards. And then from that, of course, came the allocation and all the, and there's some issues about the model, which I don't want to get into, but just to say that the science behind the water quality standards for the Bay program was the only place in the country where we had tried to use a collaborative approach to come up with it. And it would have been nice to have had some agricultural collaborators, but farmers, they wouldn't have been able to do it. Somebody would have had to have hired scientific folks who, I don't know, Penn State or Virginia Tech or someplace that could have gone through that with it. And I'm sure it would have enhanced the process. But where we find ourselves now, and why I think I want to say something about total net maximum daily loads and how they're approached. Virginia decided, this is not a criticism, we had a bunch of lawsuits that said, you know, you people have got to get on with it for total maximum daily loads. By the way, the reason we didn't give high priority to total maximum daily loads, I headed the NPDES permit program for a while. We did not need total maximum daily loads to do most of our point source permitting. Most of the point sources that we had, your local science took care of what you needed for a rather decent wasteload allocation. Only in the case of really nitrogen, phosphorus has a local component, and we could get some phosphorus requirements into permits from a local standpoint without having to have a big TMDL. But for nitrogen, it exerts its power downstream, and it exerts its power in collection with millions of other sources of nitrogen. So there wasn't any way to develop nitrogen limits if you were just sitting in Washington, D.C. working on your permit. But that was the exception, not the rule. Most things we could write permits for, even water quality-based conditions, by just using local science. But the time came when we needed to be doing much more watershed work. And I think rightly speaking, that issue was picked up. And then all of a sudden the agencies had a big requirement to do a lot of total maximum daily loads. And unfortunately, our little infant efforts to get things together by watershed got thrown out of the window, so that people said, no, let's do it by what we can do the most easily. So it was pollutant by pollutant rather than watershed by watershed. So what do? You then walk into a watershed like this one, where you might have you've got the Bay TMDLs, which are for nitrogen and phosphorus, and you might have some locally based TMDLs for coliforms, and you may have some metals, I don't know, but, so you've got to find a place where all this comes together, and guess what? The only place where it all comes together is at the local level. And so I went to a hearing about 4 years ago in the Potomac River Basin, and they said, well, Rebecca, what do we do for it? We're gonna have these Chesapeake Bay nutrient requirements, and we're gonna probably have some TMPLs for coliform, and we might have some metal problems. How do we handle this? And my only answer was, that's really where it does. The integrators, the natural integrators, are not in Washington. They're not in Richmond. They're right here at the local level, and there's enough flexibility in the Clean Water Act, I believe, to take a look at these local requirements and say, what types of approaches or technologies give us a multiple bang for the buck, give us the best bang for the buck. We might be able to get some coliform removal benefit, we might be able to get some nutrient benefit, we might be able to get some stream biology benefit, and that's why I think green infrastructure may be coming to the fore more, but it's only at the local level that you can exercise that kind of creativity. But that's what I urge people, is get a multiple bang for the buck. Before you do a lot of money to do only one thing, see if there's some things you can do that'll give you 3 or 4 things at once. And that's much more clear when you're sitting at the local level looking up at all this stuff than it is when you're looking down. So I hope that's happening. And I'm a big fan of green infrastructure. I think I heard Tom say he was kind of a fan. And I hope we can make some of those things work, especially for stormwater. Stormwater is a great opportunity for cities to start paying more attention to their green infrastructure options.
On that note, thank you all very much for coming.